They didn't shut it off to hurt her. They shut it off because no one thought she mattered. The system log updated at 2:17 a.m. with a soft mechanical chime, a single line of text buried beneath hundreds of routine adjustments. Thermal output zone C19 reduced to minimum. No alarms. No alerts. Just a quiet decision made somewhere above, in offices that never felt cold. The heating vents along the corridor exhaled one last breath of warmth before falling silent, the metal grates ticking softly as they cooled. Inside containment room C19, the temperature began to drop, slow at first, almost gentle, like a room forgetting it was ever meant to be lived in. Lyra noticed it in the way her breath lingered longer in the air, thin clouds forming and dissolving in front of her lips. She shifted on the narrow bench, the surface beneath her already cold enough to pull heat from her skin. Her fingers curled instinctively, pressing against her palms as if she could hold on to warmth that wasn't there anymore. The walls didn't respond. They never did. Frost crept along the seams of the observation glass, delicate and quiet, tracing patterns that looked almost beautiful if you didn't know what they meant. Her skin, pale blue with a faint silver sheen, lost its glow, dimming under the absence of heat, as if the light inside her was being slowly turned down. Somewhere down the hall, a maintenance cart rattled over uneven flooring, its loose wheels squeaking in a steady rhythm that echoed through the empty corridor. Ethan Cole pushed it forward with one hand, his other gripping a tablet that flickered with outdated diagnostics. He wasn't supposed to be in Zone C this late. No one was. But the system had flagged inconsistencies, minor ones, the kind that didn't get priority, the kind assigned to people like him. He yawned, rubbing the back of his neck as the overhead lights hummed faintly above him. Just another glitch, he muttered under his breath, not expecting an answer. The air felt different here. Thinner. Colder. He slowed without realizing it, his boots scraping softer against the floor as the corridor stretched ahead, dim and quiet in a way that didn't feel right. His tablet buzzed once, then stilled. Temperature variance detected. Zone C19. Within acceptable loss parameters. Ethan frowned slightly, eyes lingering on the word acceptable. He had seen that word before. Too many times. It usually meant someone, somewhere, had decided something wasn't worth fixing. He reached the door to C19 and paused. The metal surface was colder than it should have been, the chill seeping through the fabric of his gloves as his hand hovered near the control panel. For a moment, he almost walked away. That would have been easier. That would have been expected. Inside the room, Lyra's breathing had slowed. Each inhale shallow, each exhale a fading whisper against the growing cold. Her eyes, bright once, luminous with a quiet intensity, remained open, fixed on the door as if she had been waiting for something she couldn't quite name. The frost had reached the edges of the glass now, narrowing her world into a shrinking frame of clarity. The system said everything was fine. The log said nothing was wrong. No one had been notified. No one had noticed. Ethan's hand rested against the panel, unmoving, as the silence pressed in around him. Then, almost imperceptibly, he heard it. A soft, uneven sound from the other side. Not loud. Not urgent. Just there. He didn't speak. He didn't call it in. He simply stood there, listening, as something inside him refused to file it away as acceptable. The sound came again, softer this time, like something brushing against metal with no strength left to press harder, and Ethan felt it more than he heard it, a faint disturbance in the silence that refused to align with the system's calm. Indifferent readouts as his thumb hovered over the access panel and the screen flickered to life beneath it, requesting authorization he already had but rarely used. His reflection staring back at him in the dim glass, eyes tired, jaw unshaven, a man who had learned when to ignore things and when to walk away. And for a second, he almost did, his hand lowering just enough to pretend this was not his problem, because the tablet still showed the same message, still labeled everything inside as acceptable, still treated the drop in temperature as a manageable loss. And Ethan had spent years in places like this understanding exactly what that word meant when no one else was around to question it. But then the sound came again, uneven, fragile, not mechanical, not a pipe contracting or a vent settling. Something organic, something trying. And that was the part the system could not measure, the part no sensor flagged. the part that made his chest tighten in a way he could not explain as his finger pressed flat against the panel and held there, long enough for the lock to disengage with a quiet hiss that seemed louder than it should have been in a corridor this empty. The door sliding open just a few inches at first before catching on a layer of frost that had built up along the track, forcing him to push harder until it gave way with a brittle crack. Cold air spilling out immediately, sharper than anything in the hallway, biting through his uniform as if the room had been sealed off from the rest of the world, and Ethan stepped inside without thinking, the door closing behind him with a soft, final click that cut off the outside noise entirely, leaving only the faint hum of failing systems and the slow, fragile rhythm of breathing somewhere ahead. And it took a moment for his eyes to adjust to the dim light, the overhead panel flickering weakly, casting long shadows across the narrow space until he saw her, seated against the far wall, smaller than he expected, almost still except for the rise and fall of her chest, her skin catching what little light there was, blue and silver dulled to something closer to gray, like frost had settled not just on the room but on her itself, her arms wrapped loosely around her torso, not tight enough to hold warmth, just enough to remember what it felt like, and her eyes were open, fixed on him the moment he moved, not startled, not afraid, just aware, as if she had been waiting for the door to open and did not have the strength left to wonder if it would, and Ethan stopped a few feet inside, the cold pressing in around him now, sinking through his boots, climbing up his legs, his breath visible with every exhale as he glanced instinctively toward the wall panel, confirming what he already knew, the heat output set to minimum, the override locked behind administrative clearance he did not have, and for a second he just stood there, caught between protocol and something far less defined, something that did not fit into the categories he had been trained to follow, and her gaze did not leave him as her lips parted slightly, a small movement that seemed to take more effort than it should, and when she spoke her voice was barely there, thin and steady at the same time, carrying across the cold space without force. "Is this normal for your kind?" she asked, each word measured, not accusing, not emotional, just curious in a way that made the question heavier than it sounded. To let something fade when it is still here. And Ethan did not answer right away, because there was no line in his training that covered that question, no response coded into the system he carried with him. Only the quiet awareness that he had already stepped too far inside to pretend he had not seen her, and the door behind him did not open again. The question lingered in the air long after she spoke, not because it was loud, but because it was precise, cutting through the noise of routine that Ethan had relied on for years, and he found himself looking at her not as a task, not as an entry in a system, but as something the system had failed to define, his breath slowing as the cold settled deeper into his bones. The room pressing in with a quiet insistence that made standing still feel like agreement, and he shook his head slightly, more to himself than to her, before answering in a voice lower than usual, steady but unpolished. "No," he said, the word simple, unprotected. "It is not supposed to be." And the silence that followed felt different, less empty, as if the room itself had shifted in response to something finally being acknowledged, his eyes moving again to the wall panel, fingers hovering over the manual interface, knowing the system would not allow a full override, not without credentials far above his level. But there were always small gaps, small imperfections in design, the kind maintenance workers learned to navigate because no system was ever built perfectly, and Ethan stepped closer, pulling off his glove to feel the panel directly, the surface cold enough to sting his skin as he accessed the secondary menu, a layer buried beneath standard controls, his movements careful, practiced, adjusting output limits by fractions instead of commands, nudging the system rather than confronting it, and somewhere above them a relay clicked, faint but real, followed by a low hum that returned to the vents along the wall, weak at first, almost uncertain, but enough to shift the air by a few degrees, enough to interrupt the steady decline that had been marked as acceptable, and Ethan let out a breath he did not realize he was holding as the faintest trace of warmth brushed against his face. Not much, not nearly enough, but it was something, and in a place like this, something mattered. He turned back toward her then, watching closely as the change reached her, subtle at first, the frost along the edges of her skin no longer spreading, her breathing deepening by a fraction, still fragile, but no longer fading at the same pace. And her eyes remained on him, studying, not with suspicion, but with a kind of quiet calculation that felt older than anything in the room, as if she was measuring not the action itself, but the reason behind it. And Ethan shifted slightly under that gaze, and used to being examined like that, especially by someone the system had already dismissed. "It will not hold for long," he said after a moment, nodding toward the vents. "They will see the adjustment eventually." And it was the truth. Systems like this corrected themselves, or someone higher up would notice the deviation and reset it without ever asking why it had changed, and she seemed to understand that, her gaze lowering briefly to her hands before returning to him, her voice still quiet, but clearer now, carrying just a little more strength than before. "Then why change it at all?" she asked, not as a challenge, but as a genuine question, one that expected an answer beyond procedure, beyond obligation. And Ethan hesitated again, not because he did not know, but because saying it out loud made it real in a way he could not undo. His eyes, drifting for a second to the door behind him, still closed, still offering the same easy exit it had before, and then back to her. And this time when he spoke, there was no hesitation left. "Because you are still here," he said, the words plain, unremarkable in structure, but heavier than anything he had said that night. And something in her expression shifted, not dramatically, not in a way most people would notice, but enough that the room did not feel as cold as it had a moment ago, even before the heat began to rise. The warmth that returned was fragile, uneven, barely enough to push back against the cold that had already settled into the walls, but it changed the rhythm of the room, and Ethan could feel it in the way his fingers no longer felt numb against the panel, in the way the air moved just enough to remind him that the system had not completely given up yet. And across from him Lyra shifted for the first time since he had entered. Not much, just a slight adjustment of her shoulders as if her body was remembering how to respond to something other than loss. Her arms loosening from where they had been wrapped around herself. Her breathing deeper now, still controlled, still careful, but no longer fading at the edges. And Ethan stepped back from the wall, giving the vents space, as if that would somehow help the heat spread faster. Even though he knew it would not, the system did not work that way. Nothing in this place ever moved quickly unless it was shutting something down, and he rubbed his hands together once, the friction doing little against the lingering cold that clung to him. His eyes flicking briefly to the door again, calculating time without checking it, knowing he had already stayed longer than he should have. That every second here increased the chance that someone would notice the deviation, that a supervisor or an automated audit would flag the anomaly and send someone down this corridor. And still he did not move toward the exit. Instead, he reached up and unclipped the outer layer of his jacket, the fabric thick, insulated, designed to retain heat during long maintenance shifts in underregulated zones. And he hesitated only a moment before stepping forward and placing it carefully around her shoulders, not draping it loosely but adjusting it so it actually held warmth, the way he had learned years ago in environments where temperature meant survival more than comfort. His movements deliberate, respectful, never rushing, and Lyra watched him the entire time, her gaze following each motion as if she was trying to understand not just what he was doing, but why it was done with such care. And when his hands pulled back, the jacket remained, the dark material contrasting against her pale skin, absorbing what little heat there was and holding it close. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the only sound the faint hum of the vents working harder than they had before. And then she lifted one hand slowly, fingers brushing against the fabric, testing it, not out of doubt, but out of unfamiliarity. And her voice came again, steadier now, carrying just enough strength to feel present in the room. "This is yours," she said, not questioning, simply stating a fact. And Ethan gave a small nod, shifting his weight back onto his heels. "It works better on you right now," he replied, the answer simple, almost dismissive if not for the way he stayed where he was instead of stepping away. And something in her expression softened again, not visibly to most, but enough that the space between them felt less like a barrier and more like a shared point of quiet understanding. And she looked at him for a long second before speaking again, her tone thoughtful, almost analytical. "Your systems marked this as acceptable loss," she said, her eyes drifting briefly toward the vents and then back to him. "But you did not." and Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath visible between them as he considered the statement, knowing there was no benefit in denying it. No reason to pretend otherwise. Systems do not feel the cold, he said finally, his voice low, even. They just measure it. And the words hung there, not heavy, not dramatic, just true in a way that did not need emphasis. And Lyra's gaze remained on him, steady, observant, as if she was storing that answer somewhere deeper than memory, and for the first time since he had entered the room, Ethan realized that the cold was no longer the only thing changing. Something else had shifted too. Something quieter, something harder to quantify, and it did not show up on any system display. It did not trigger any alert, but it was there all the same, in the space between a human who stayed and someone who had been left behind. The heat held, barely, a thin layer of resistance against the cold that still owned most of the room. But it was enough to change the way time moved, no longer counting down in silent degrees, but stretching just enough for choice to exist. And Ethan felt that shift as he stood there, the chill still clinging to his arms now that his jacket was gone, the fabric of his undershirt doing little to hold warmth as he flexed his fingers once, testing circulation, grounding himself in the present, instead of the system readouts that would inevitably correct what he had done. And across from him Lyra adjusted again, more noticeably this time, her shoulders settling under the weight of the jacket, her posture no longer fixed in that rigid stillness that came from conserving energy, and she drew a slightly deeper breath, the air catching in her lungs for a moment before releasing, visible but steadier. And her eyes did not leave him, not out of suspicion, but with a focus that felt intentional, as if she was learning him the way one studies an unfamiliar environment. And when she spoke again, her voice carried more presence, still soft, still controlled, but no longer fading at the edges. "Your body is losing heat," she said, her gaze dropping briefly to his uncovered arms before returning to his face, not accusatory, just observant. And Ethan gave a small, almost dismissive shrug, though the motion was tighter than usual, the cold already beginning to settle deeper now that he had given up his primary insulation. "It is manageable," he replied, the words simple, practiced, the kind of answer that closed a subject rather than opened one. But she did not look convinced, her head tilting slightly, the movement subtle but deliberate, as if recalibrating her understanding, and she shifted again, this time with intent, one hand moving to the edge of the jacket as if to remove it. And Ethan noticed immediately, stepping forward just enough to stop the motion without touching her, his voice firmer than before, not loud, but unmistakably clear. "Keep it," he said, the tone carrying something beyond suggestion, something closer to instruction. And she paused, her hand still resting on the fabric as her eyes met his again, holding there for a second longer than before, measuring the insistence behind the words. And then slowly, she let the jacket settle back into place, her hand lowering to her lap, accepting the decision without argument. And the silence that followed felt different again, not empty, but shared, the kind that did not need to be filled to be understood. And somewhere above them a distant relay clicked, followed by a faint shift in the hum of the system, subtle but enough for Ethan to notice, his head turning slightly toward the wall as his expression tightened, not in fear, but in recognition. The system was adjusting, correcting, pulling resources back toward baseline, undoing what he had changed. And he moved quickly this time, stepping back to the panel and accessing the controls again, his fingers moving faster now, less cautious, pushing the limits a little further than before, extending the temporary override beyond what it was meant to hold, knowing it would draw attention, but also knowing time mattered more than discretion at this point. And the vents responded with a slightly stronger hum, the air warming by another small degree, enough to be felt without being seen. And Ethan exhaled slowly, watching the numbers stabilize just above critical thresholds, not safe, but no longer declining. And when he turned back to her again, Lyra was still watching him, but there was something new in her expression now, not just observation, not just calculation, but something quieter, something that did not belong to systems or logic. And she spoke once more, her voice steady, grounded, carrying a clarity that had not been there before. "You are choosing to stay," she said, not as a question, not needing confirmation. And Ethan met her gaze without hesitation this time, The answer. Already decided long before he had spoken it. Yes, he said, and the word did not echo. It did not need to. It simply settled into the room, as real as the warmth slowly returning, as real as the cold that had not yet left, and far beyond the walls of C-19, unnoticed by anyone who mattered to the system. Something small and unmeasured continued to grow in a place that had been marked as expendable. The system did not like being ignored, and Ethan could feel it in the way the panel resisted his input now, the interface lagging by fractions of a second, as if something upstream had started paying attention, the faint hum in the walls shifting into a tighter frequency that carried a warning he had learned to recognize over years of maintenance work. Not an alarm, not yet, but a recalibration, a quiet correction trying to bring everything back to what it considered normal, and Ethan leaned closer to the panel, his breath fogging the surface as his fingers moved faster across the manual controls, bypassing prompts, extending the override window by seconds at a time instead of minutes, because minutes would trigger flags, but seconds could still slip through, and behind him the air changed again, warmer by another small degree, just enough that the sting in his hands eased slightly, just enough that the cold stopped advancing, and he exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in focus, his mind already calculating how long he could hold this before the system escalated. And when he turned back toward her, Lyra had shifted closer to the wall where the vent released its weak stream of heat, not out of desperation, but with intention, positioning herself to use what little energy remained in the room as efficiently as possible, her movements controlled, precise, nothing wasted. And the jacket around her shoulders had begun to hold that warmth, trapping it, creating a small pocket of survivable space in an otherwise failing environment, and her eyes lifted to meet his again, studying him with that same quiet intensity. But now there was something else beneath it, something less analytical, something closer to understanding, and she spoke again, her voice steadier than before, carrying across the room without effort. "Your system is correcting," she said, not asking, simply stating what she could already sense, and Ethan nodded once, glancing back at the panel briefly before answering. "It always does," he replied, the words carrying a weight that went beyond the machine in front of him, and she watched him for a moment longer before speaking again, her tone shifting slightly, softer, but more direct. "Then you will not be able to maintain this." And it was not a challenge, not a warning, just a conclusion drawn from observation, and Ethan did not deny it, because there was no point. The system was larger than both of them, designed to outlast interference, designed to prioritize efficiency over everything else, including what sat in this room. And he stepped away from the panel again, the cold reaching for him immediately as he left its limited warmth, settling back into his arms, his shoulders, his breath slowing as his body adjusted, and he moved closer to her this time, not standing at a distance, but lowering himself to sit against the wall a few feet away, close enough to share the small pocket of heat the vent provided, but not so close as to intrude, his back resting against the metal surface that still held the memory of cold. And he drew one slow breath, then another, letting his body find a rhythm that did not fight the environment but endured it. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence settling again, but not empty, not distant, just present. And then Lyra shifted slightly, turning her head just enough to face him more directly, her gaze no longer measuring, no longer questioning, but holding steady in a way that felt almost human. And she asked, quietly, "Why does it matter to you?" The question simple, but different from before, not about systems, not about actions, but about him. And Ethan let the question sit for a moment, his eyes drifting to the floor between them, to the faint pattern of frost that had stopped spreading, to the subtle warmth holding its ground against the cold. And when he answered, his voice was lower, not guarded, not distant, just honest in a way he did not usually allow. "Because I have seen what happens when no one does anything," he said, the words steady, not rushed, not explained further, and something in the way he said it carried more than the sentence itself, something that did not need detail to be understood. And Lyra did not look away, did not interrupt. She simply listened, the silence after his words stretching just long enough to settle into the space between them. And then she nodded once, a small, deliberate motion that acknowledged not just the answer, but the choice behind it. And in that moment, the system continued its quiet corrections. The cold still waited at the edges of the room, but something else had taken root inside it. Something the system could not measure, something it could not override, something that did not belong to numbers or thresholds, but to the simple, unrecorded fact that one person had chosen to stay when leaving would have been easier. The change did not come from the panel this time, and Ethan noticed it before he understood it, a subtle shift in the air that did not follow the system's usual patterns. The warmth no longer pulsing in uneven intervals from the vent, but settling, stabilizing, as if something inside the room itself had begun to respond, and he lifted his head slightly, eyes narrowing toward the faint shimmer that traced along the edges of Lyra's skin, no longer dull, no longer fading, but slowly returning to that soft blue-silver glow he had first seen when he entered. And it was not just light, it carried heat, gentle but real, radiating outward in a way the vents had failed to achieve. And Ethan stayed still, watching, because this was not something he could fix or adjust. This was something he could only witness. And Lyra's posture shifted again, her shoulders straightening not out of effort, but out of regained strength. The jacket around her no longer just insulation but a bridge, holding the warmth between them, and she closed her eyes for a brief moment, drawing in a deeper breath than before, steady and full. And when she exhaled, the air did not fog as heavily, the temperature around her no longer collapsing into frost, and Ethan let out a slow breath of his own, not relief exactly, but recognition that something had changed beyond his control, beyond the system. And the panel behind him flickered once, a small warning icon appearing and disappearing too quickly for most to notice. But he saw it. He always saw those details. The system was escalating, recalculating the anomaly in this room, preparing to correct it in a more direct way. And Ethan knew what that meant. Manual inspection. Personnel sent down this corridor, questions asked that did not have safe answers. And he pushed himself up from the wall, the movement slower now as the cold that had settled into his body made itself known, his muscles tighter, his breath heavier. But he stood anyway, stepping back toward the panel with a focus that had sharpened rather than weakened, his fingers moving across the interface again, not trying to increase the heat this time, but to delay detection, to stretch the window just a little longer, rerouting minor diagnostics, masking the fluctuation as routine variance, small lies written into a system that preferred numbers over context. And behind him the warmth continued to build, not rapidly, not dramatically, but steadily. And he glanced back once more, unable not to, and what he saw made him pause. Lyra's skin now held a faint luminescence that pulsed in slow intervals, synchronized with her breathing, each inhale drawing in what little heat remained in the room, each exhale releasing it back, amplified, shared. And it was not random. It was controlled, intentional in a way that suggested this was not a reaction, but an ability, something her species carried that the system had never accounted for. And she opened her eyes again, meeting his gaze with a clarity that had not been there before, not fragile, not fading, but present in full. And she spoke, her voice no longer thin, no longer strained, but calm and steady. Your presence altered the threshold, she said, the words precise, but carrying something softer beneath them, something that was not purely analytical. And Ethan frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in the quiet realization that she was not just observing the system, she was interpreting something else entirely. And he took a small step closer again, the warmth reaching him now, easing the tightness in his chest, the stiffness in his hands. And he shook his head once, the motion subtle, almost reflexive. I just stayed, he replied, the answer simple, almost dismissive, but she held his gaze, unmoving, as if the simplicity of the statement was exactly what mattered. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the room no longer defined by its cold, no longer collapsing inward, but holding steady in a balance that should not have been possible. And beyond the walls, beyond the silent corrections of the system, something had already begun to shift, not in the data, not in the logs, but in the space between two beings who had chosen, in different ways, not to let the other fade. The warmth no longer belonged to the system at all, and Ethan could tell because the panel behind him had stopped responding in meaningful ways. its indicators flickering between conflicting readings that no longer matched the air he could feel against his skin, the numbers trying to correct something they did not understand. And for the first time since he entered the room, he stepped away from the controls without looking back, because whatever was happening now was not something he could manage through code or overrides. It was something else entirely, and the space around Lyra had changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would trigger alarms on its own, but in a steady, undeniable shift that made the cold retreat inch by inch, her skin now carrying that soft, luminous glow with consistency, no longer fading between breaths. Each exhale releasing a gentle wave of heat that did not dissipate immediately but lingered, layering into the air, building something stable where there had been only loss before, and Ethan felt it reach him fully now, not just at the edges, but across his arms, his chest, easing the tightness that had begun to settle there. And he let out a slow breath, his shoulders lowering slightly as his body responded, not with relief, but with the recognition that survival was no longer uncertain. And Lyra watched him as he adjusted, her gaze steady, no longer measuring him as an unknown variable, but acknowledging him as part of the environment that had changed. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a quiet certainty, no strain, no hesitation. "It stabilizes when intent is consistent," she said, the words precise, but softer than before, as if they were meant for him rather than as an observation. And Ethan tilted his head slightly, not fully understanding the mechanism, but understanding enough of what she meant, and he gave a small nod, the motion simple, grounded. "Then it should hold," he replied, not as a question, but as a belief he was choosing to stand by. And for a moment the room remained still, the hum of the vents now secondary to the subtle rhythm of her breathing, the air no longer biting, no longer draining, but holding steady in a balance that should not have been possible under the system's rules. And then the corridor beyond the door shifted, a faint vibration traveling through the metal, followed by the distant sound of footsteps, measured, synchronized, not hurried but purposeful, the kind of movement that did not belong to maintenance crews or routine checks. And Ethan's head turned immediately, his focus sharpening as his body reacted before his thoughts caught up. He had delayed detection, not prevented it. And now the system had responded in the only way it knew how, by sending someone to confirm what the data could not resolve. And he pushed himself fully upright, stepping between Lyra and the door without thinking about the gesture, his position natural, unforced, not defensive in appearance but absolute in intent. And he glanced once at the panel, confirming what he already suspected, manual inspection requested, authorization en route, and he exhaled slowly, not in fear, but in preparation, because leaving now was still an option. It always had been. The door was not locked, the corridor beyond still open to him. And if he stepped out, if he returned to his cart, to his assigned route, none of this would follow him. It would be written off, corrected, forgotten. And he stood there for a second, feeling the warmth behind him, steady now, real in a way the system had never intended. And he did not move toward the exit. He did not step aside. Instead, he adjusted his stance slightly, grounding himself in place. And when he spoke, it was not to the approaching footsteps, not to the system, but quietly, just enough for her to hear. "They are coming," he said, the words calm, without urgency, without panic. And behind him Lyra did not shift away, did not retreat, the glow around her remaining steady, unchanged. And when she answered, her voice carried something new, not just clarity, not just strength, but a quiet assurance that did not depend on the system at all. "Then they will see," she said, and the words settled into the room with a weight that did not need to be explained, because for the first time since the heat had been turned off, the outcome was no longer defined by what the system decided to ignore. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and for a moment everything went still, not quiet in the way the room had been before, but suspended, as if the space itself was waiting to see which version of reality would take hold, the one defined by the system or the one that had quietly formed inside these walls. And Ethan stood where he was, shoulders squared, not rigid, not aggressive, just present in a way that did not move when pressure approached, his eyes fixed on the sealed door as the access panel beside it flickered to life, a soft tone indicating incoming authorization, higher clearance, higher priority. the kind that did not ask questions before acting, and the lock disengaged with a controlled hiss, the door sliding open in a smooth, mechanical motion that revealed two figures in standard inspection uniforms, their presence clean, precise, everything about them aligned with protocol, their eyes moving immediately to the panel, to the readings, to the anomaly they had been sent to correct, and then, almost as an afterthought, to the room itself. And that was where the pause happened, subtle, but unmistakable, because the room did not match the data they had been given. The temperature was stable, the frost had receded, and at the center of it stood something the system had already written off, no longer fading, no longer failing, but present in a way that demanded recognition. And Ethan did not speak. He did not step forward. He simply held his position, not blocking, not challenging, but refusing to become invisible again. And behind him the warmth remained steady, not fluctuating, not dependent on the failing vents, but sustained by something quieter, something that did not register on their instruments in a way they could easily categorize. And one of the inspectors glanced down at their handheld device, scrolling through the system logs, the numbers no longer aligning with what they were seeing, and the other took a step into the room, slow, measured, their attention shifting from the panel to Lyra, their expression not emotional, but no longer indifferent, because indifference required certainty, and certainty was no longer available here, and Lyra did not shrink back, did not lower her gaze. She remained where she was, the jacket still around her shoulders, the soft blue-silver light steady across her skin, her breathing calm, controlled, each exhale carrying that same gentle warmth into the space around her. And when she spoke, her voice was clear, not raised, not forced, just present in a way that did not need volume to be heard. Your system marked this environment as acceptable, she said, her eyes moving between them, not accusing, not pleading, simply stating what had been done, and there was a brief silence. The kind that comes when a statement cannot be dismissed but has not yet been processed, and Ethan felt it too, the shift in control, the moment where the narrative was no longer dictated by logs and thresholds, but by what stood in front of them, undeniable. And one of the inspectors looked back at the panel again, then at Ethan, then back to Lyra, their posture adjusting slightly, not relaxed, but no longer purely procedural, and Ethan did not fill the silence. He did not explain, did not justify, because there was nothing to add that would make the moment more real than it already was. And finally, the second inspector spoke, their voice controlled, but carrying a note that had not been there before, something closer to reconsideration than command. We will reevaluate the classification. They said, the words simple, but heavy in implication, and Ethan let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. Not relief, not victory, just the release of tension that had been building since the moment he chose to stay. And Lyra's gaze softened slightly, not in gratitude, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement, and the warmth in the room held steady, no longer fragile, no longer fighting to exist, just present, as if it had always belonged there and had only been waiting for someone to notice. And as the inspectors stepped further inside, their attention no longer fixed on correction but on understanding, Ethan remained where he was for 1 second longer before finally shifting, not away, not back, but simply enough to stand beside her instead of in front of her. And in that quiet adjustment, without announcement or recognition, something fundamental changed, not in the system, not in the reports that would follow, but in the simple, unrecorded truth that the difference between acceptable loss and something worth saving had never been the numbers. It had been the moment someone chose to see it.